You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Today I'm sitting down with Logan Isaac. And after reading through Logan's website, here's how he describes himself. And I will let him describe himself a little more in our conversation here. Logan is a Christian soldier and Iraq veteran, writing in the wake of war as an author, advocate, entrepreneur, in an effort to cultivate conversation and community around religion and our armed service. So Logan, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here today.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Logan, I want to dig a little in just to your story. And so like, as I've read, because I know you through a friend and I've read through your stuff online, you know, I want you to talk a little about your journey. So what has led you from being a soldier to being an author and an advocate? I mean, as I look through this, you've got like a master's of theological studies at Duke, and you have and you've gone to University of St. Andrews in Scotland. This doesn't necessarily sound like a normal career path from soldier to advocate. So tell me a little more about your story.
Well, luckily, a lot of people ask me that, so I wrote a book. In 2013, I wrote Reborn on the 4th of July with University Press. I don't know. I went into the military because I needed college money. And I'd always thought of myself as kind of a decently good person. And when I was at Fort Bragg on 9/11 as a paratrooper, and it just kind of followed from there. I went to, actually my unit didn't deploy, so I went to, I re-enlisted in 2002, went to Hawaii to train out in Schofield Barracks, and then we got our deployment orders from there, and I deployed January of 2004, came home February 2005, and I was never really... I don't think I was very evangelical, but I went to youth group in high school. Occasionally I went to chapel while I was in the military. But it was just kind of like coasting by. Even in high school, I got a 2.38 because I wasn't all that engaged. And then I got into the military, and I really was challenged to figure out what my limitations were and what my potential was. And so I became a really good artilleryman. And when we were in Iraq, it really makes you think about what's important and what's not important. When you are the extension of foreign policy of your own country, it's hard to hide the fact that there's stuff that goes on outside your borders that's important. Mm-hmm. And so I don't remember what set it off, but I read the 9/11 Commission report when I was in Iraq, and that was interesting. And the turning point for me was from being maybe happily ignorant of really deeply political things, was when I watched an American soldier die really slowly, and in a way that shouldn't have happened. It wasn't enemy contact. It wasn't heroic. It was just stupid. Somebody was tired and they were behind the wheel and they flipped a Humvee full of 9 soldiers. A couple of people were pretty seriously injured. I think one guy lost his leg and another guy ended up dying. And that was 9 months into my 13-month deployment, I think. And because my unit actually was deploying all over the place within the country of Iraq. And so we saw a lot of action. Nobody got hurt because we never built up any habits or patterns. But we saw a lot of action. And so I thought to myself, I was really struck by, this guy who died, who's my own skin color, my own sex, my own nationality. I found out later my own height, weight, hair color, eye color. But I didn't really care, or it didn't, affect me so much when I watched a bunch of brown bodies expire. and trying to be a person that aspires to the good, that really kind of shook me to my core. And so reading the 9/11 Commission report, and I started really reading my Bible toward the end of my deployment. And then when I got home, really, startled me. It was a spiritual awakening. And so I took some night classes. I started reading John Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas and a bunch of others that are a little bit more obscure. And I was convinced, like, Christians can't be engaging in violence in this way. But I had been in by then for 5 years, and some of the peripheral claims that pacifists make in the church, some of them are more explicit. But every now and then I would hear, like, the military is inherently evil, and I just didn't buy it. And frankly, I had a lot more experience to base that conclusion on than a lot of the pacifists that I was reading and speaking to. And so I found out that I could apply to be a conscientious objector, and that I could even apply to be a CO and not ask for discharge, because I felt this calling to return to the Middle East. I had this kind of weird vision that I described in the book. And so I decided to ask to be a noncombatant. I told my infantry unit that we'd come down on orders again. And I told them, look, I'm packed, ready to go, but I'm not gonna draw my weapon. And so that was interesting. Long story short, I was not allowed to deploy with them, and I eventually was discharged. And I still felt this call to the Middle East, and so on my way processing out of the military, I had heard about Christian peacemaker teams, and so I touched base with them, and they had this delegation going to Israel, Palestine right around the time I was supposed to be starting my terminal leave. So I was like, I'll do it. And so when they got an application to go to the Middle East from an active duty soldier, they said, are you sure you got the right place? So I talked to them, and over time they realized where I was coming from. And the only stipulation they said is that I had to grow out my beard, because when we go into Palestine, people may think that you're Mossad. They may think you're Israeli intelligence and kidnap you and either kill you or hold you for ransom. So right after getting out of the military, I found myself in Palestine and learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in Hebron, and traveling around Palestine for a month with peaceniks essentially. I really my pendulum swung to the other side, and I really felt convicted as a former military person. And one time in particular, we were passing through an Israeli Defense Forces patrol in Hebron, and I found myself getting really indescribably angry. Like I was just overcome by anger. And we got back to the apartment where we were staying that night, and every night in CPT for short-term delegations, you do check-ins, and we just go around the circle and say, how are you doing? And so it came to me, and before I even knew what I was saying, before I knew the words that were coming out of my lips, I said, I think I saw myself in them. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I hadn't dealt with and processed my own complicity in American military violence, and I still was mad at myself. And that's when I realized how easy it is to be an enemy on both sides of the gun. Mm. And so becoming an advocate, I use that phrase because an advocate, it derives from the Latin advocare, to call beside or to call to. And as I was getting out, before I went to Israel, Palestine, I fell into what was then called the Community of Communities. Simple Way, Shane Claiborne, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, mm-hmm. Brian McLaren, that kind of crowd. And they would refer other Christian soldiers to me. And in the midst of hearing all these systematic propositional kind of theological crap about just war theory or pacifism, I could sniff out people's agenda. They either wanted me to stay in or they wanted me to get out, or and so in these conversations with other soldiers and vets, just in sharing our experiences and being there for one another and maintaining that camaraderie and connection that we had, even in the midst of these really difficult questions, I found that to be much more inspiring and educational. and so since I've gotten out, since before I got out, I continue to receive emails and phone calls and sometimes snail mail from other soldiers and vets wrestling through these same questions. And so that's what it means to be an advocate to me, is to help someone who's on the journey as well at a different point, maybe earlier, maybe later. And it's also a legal term. In French, an advocate is literally an attorney. And so recently I've been getting into federal legislation and protection for vets. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole, but that's kind of where that's the framework through which I kind of came to it, I guess.
No, that's fascinating too. And you'd kind of mentioned this, and that I think that, especially when you're talking in like the Christian sphere, it's very easy to fall into these weird binary, like this or this terms for stuff. Yeah. You know, it's either you're either fully this or you're fully that. Mm-hmm. And you know, you were kind of like hinting at this, but I want you to tease out a little bit like where you're at too. When we begin to think about these ideas of like, am I a patriot or am I a pacifist? You know, I mean, and because it sounds like that you kind of are standing in the middle. Of that.
Yeah, you know, I don't know what I would identify as anymore. I am convinced that Christians should not be engaging in violence, but I'm also really cautious about absolutes like that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the classic question that objectors are asked is, well, you know, what if somebody broke into your house and was going to like kill your kid or rape your wife or whatever the heck it is? And the answer for me has never changed. It's like, what term do I give that? And the answer to me is like, you know, I'd probably do something. My intent would not be to kill them. I might feel like I want to, but I would incapacitate them. That's what I would do. And then I'd be the first one to call 911 because, again, we're called to help people, whether we like it or not, to love our enemies. And then once that person is stabilized or, you know, out of my hair, I would go to church and I would tell my priest and I would say, look, you know, I messed him up. Like, you know, I broke his jaw or whatever, you know, whatever I think in my head I might do, because theoretically I'm an asshole. So I don't know what to call that. I think too often my experience of conservative imagination is that, well, that's not evil or that's not bad because he started it. I think to myself, like, I used to say that when I was like 5 years old. Like, are we going to grow out of that or what? And so in the way I reconcile that in my mind is just to call it, you know, what classically it's been called, which is a necessary evil, and to not call it anything but, and we repent for evil. So I hurt this guy. I did something wrong. Maybe I owe him an apology. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about that, but like, I would never call that good. I would never call that justified. And so that's what differentiates me, I think, from pacifists in saying like, it's not that I will refrain from violence. It's that we live in a violent world, and what are we going to do about it? And too often, I think what's informing these two frameworks, on the one hand, for pacifists, and I can get all into the theology of it, but like for pacifists, Jesus was an example. Like we are called to be that people, right? And so Jesus was killed rather than you know, he didn't kill, he was killed. And that's fine. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And then on the conservative or the, you know, the patriotic side, it's like, well, you know, Rome was not so hot, but like America, like that's something I could get behind. The problem with that is that, you know, what happens if you wake up one day and you realize, like, when the eschaton comes and all the angels are rejoicing that America is no more, what are you going to be doing? Mm-hmm. Like, if you can't look at our country or any country and say, look, there's a finite good at best, then you might not be worshiping the God of Jesus's scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and you probably aren't reading our, you know, Christian scripture, the Gospels and epistles and stuff all that well. And so, yeah, I think the middle ground is, I don't, even if as I say that, I think to myself, it's a compromise, like you're losing out on something, but I'm a pragmatist. Like, yeah, we are called to love this world. And that means that if I commit violence, I need to call it for what it is. and own it, as opposed to export it by saying, oh, it was their problem, they started, that absolves me, or hey, I'll never commit violence, or like any violence I commit, like, oh, woe is me. Like, no, sometimes you'll do it and you'll feel good about it. That's the difficulty in talking to Christian soldiers. Like, you hear, there's one young man that I've mentored. He told me, I'm convinced he hasn't told anybody else prior to this. He told me about killing someone. And luckily, I have never looked down my rifle sight and pulled the trigger. I was an artilleryman, however. So I very, 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 very likely did cause serious harm, injury, or death to people. I just don't have a number or face or names or anything like that. But this young man did. And he told me in a rather confessional tone, like, I was elated. He was pointing a weapon at me, and I killed him. And I immediately was flooded with this sense of joy and happiness and gratitude. Like, oh my, thank God I killed him. And then in a split second, you're hit with the reality that you just ended another human's life. And there's almost nothing as morally dense as that. And so in terms of our scripture, like, I love the fact that the centurion on the cross is the one most directly responsible for ending the bodily life of our Savior. When he takes his weapon of war, a spear, which is not used in urban settings, takes a spear as though he's on a battlefield, and he pierces the side and the heart of another human being who is also fully God. And that's like, can you imagine the depths of hell that you would be condemned to if that were all you did? And then just a few verses later, and the text is ambiguous. In the Catholic tradition, and I believe my own Anglican and possibly Orthodox tradition, because the text is ambiguous, they assign that these words to the same person. This centurion is at the foot of the cross, and he says, surely this must be the Son of God. He beats all 11 apostles by nearly a chapter in confessing that. And that to me seems like a big deal. Like the moral diversity and nuance and complexity of a Christian soldier, like, there's just no getting away from it. And it's possibly the most diverse character in our scripture is, people who do violence on God's behalf, or in furtherance of God's will. We can get into like atonement and all that crap, but like, that's a huge rabbit hole.
No, I love it. And I love how you are kind of bringing, I mean, one, you're bringing like scholarship to view, but you're also bringing experience into this, as you speak through this, whether it be through stuff that you've experienced or those or experiences of others that you've journeyed with. And one of the things,
that's what knowledge is about. Like, that's one of my, I when I was at St. Andrews, I got a Master of Letters in Systematic and Historical Theology. And the joke is, like, I can't stand systematics. I think it's a joke. The idea that you can come to some like conclusion apart from embodied reality is just ludicrous. And the Greeks knew it. I mean, there's a difference between phronesis and techne. Like, you have to add experience. That's why in academia, like, you have to cite your sources because you're finite. And so there's this anyway. That's when I got out of the military and I wanted to do theology. I knew just pragmatically, like, if I ever wanted to do academic stuff, like, I had to justify what I did for 6 years. Like, what's the academic or intellectual value of that? And so that it was like written into my story. Like, what was this? When I came home from Iraq, I remember consciously thinking to myself, if I can find some value in this, it won't conquer me. If I can learn something, if I can find like a mustard seed of goodness in this, I will know. I have confidence that it will never overcome me. And I don't know what to believe other than that I was able to do that.
Well, one question I wanted to ask you too, because I feel like you have a very unique perspective on these things, and I'd love to be able to hear your input on it, and especially like we're living in this time where it feels like American culture has become incredibly divided, incredibly polarized, and and the more we become polarized, the less rational we become, because we get to this place where we're incapable of hearing from the other side. And so, it ends up being like we just get further and further away, and we just really just listen to our own echo chambers of the things that agree to us, that agree with our beliefs. And this is one thing, because this is something I've struggled with too, especially within evangelical Christianity, is like, this idea that we are a Christian nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you tease this out? How do you wrestle this out? This idea of this, that we have God and we have country, and how do those two blend in a weird stew in your brain? God and country.
I think for me, because of my experience getting out of the military and falling in with communities made up, not largely, but there's a good number of like Christian anarchists in the communities I was a part of before I, went back to school and all that stuff. And so I'm really sympathetic to the idea of no gods but God, and that the government can and has in the past tried to assert itself as God.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if I'm convinced that the country or that fabrication or falsification of God is as important as the kind of falsification of a God that we do internally. And so, because I'm a soldier, and because I've gone to war, and I do not call that good, I've acquired a certain healthy amount of self-criticism. So, for example, every Christmas, which is also my birthday, I ask for friends and family to send me letters, and I've done this at least since 2007 or 8. And I have this thing: I don't want to be an asshole. I really don't. I really want to be a good person, but I know I won't know how I'm being an asshole unless people tell me. And usually that comes out in shouting matches or like angry emails, and you never hear from them again. So every year on my birthday, I say, write me a letter and tell me what I've done to you. Tell me how I've hurt you. Tell me what I've done good also, but like, tell me what I've done poorly so that I can improve. Like, what better gift than to be able to see your own faults and improve upon them? And so that has painted itself in my mind onto what it means to be a Christian. Like when I say I'm a sinner, like I know what that means. I have images in my head and sounds and smells that remind me of that, and not overpoweringly, because I do believe that I'm forgiven, and being forgiven is not a ticket to continue to sin boldly. But it's a reminder of keeping that thing in me at bay that wants to believe that the problem is outside myself. The problem always starts inside. When we have decided that we are just fine, thank you very much, and it's the other guy's problem, thank you for not making me like these other people. That's the parable of the tax collector and the publican, or the tax collector and the Pharisee. And so that to me is like, almost at the center of my understanding of the Christian faith is to continually be on guard against self-idolization. And it can be really subtle. Like, I thought I was a good person. I was actually, like, I remember at an ambush in the Joff, I didn't fire my weapon. And it's because I was really discriminative about like what targets I engaged, quote unquote. And I didn't see any. Like, there was no reason to pull my trigger. I'm not, like, we had enough suppressing fire. It made sense. Like, I'm not gung ho. And then when we got back to base, I heard some of my battle buddies whispering about like my nickname was Lucky, and like they were concerned that I didn't fire my weapon, and that made me feel good. And so I went for a long time thinking like, man, I'm a pretty good person. And it all came crashing down when I realized good people don't look at human beings dying and not feel anything. There's another name for that. There's probably a lot of other names. And so if we're a Christian nation, that means that we know what repentance means. If we are a Christian people, that means that we place the needs and expectations of others before ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Being a Christian nation isn't being the most powerful. That's a really messed up way of imagining what it means for God to be strong. Like God's strength or omnipotence is not like, yeah, he can move any rock that he imagines. Being strong is like Cool Hand Luke, where Paul Newman keeps getting beat down and he wins because he keeps getting up. Never takes a strike. He never strikes another, his opponent. His understanding of winning means that the other guy gets beaten down and stays down. And Paul Newman just keeps getting up. And can you imagine if you were God, would your strength, or would people be more impressed by how much you can do, or by how much you can withstand? Think of how much suffering is in the world. That's my understanding of God. God can carry that. I can't. That's what it means to be strong to me. And so, Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech from the presidency is really popular in pacifists because he warns against the military-industrial complex. And he says, I hope that we'll be humble but confident with power. And we've just lost sight of the humility part of it because, there's probably a number of reasons. We've got plenty of confidence, not so much humility.
No, that's very true. And on that tangent a little bit, I would love to be able to hear your perspective about our issues with gun violence in America.
Yeah, I don't know.
How can we fix it? Come on, Logan. I think you can fix it right here, right now. Come on.
I don't know if I'm against guns. That's another thing that I just don't. I don't know. I don't have much stake in. For me, I felt very clearly like it was a voice, or maybe not a voice, but it's very clear. One of the few places in my life where I felt very clearly that God was communicating to me was Middle East, no weapon, and that was it. And so I told my unit, look, I'm not going to draw a weapon. I was fine carrying a K-bar or a pocket knife because, maybe I need to cut a piece of rope or I don't know, whatever. But I couldn't imagine what a firearm would be good for other than putting holes in things. And it's hard to put a hole in a thing that moves that fast and that small, other than like heads and hearts. And so that's, at least for me, like why I wouldn't carry a weapon into battle. But I've talked to friends about I've never gone hunting. And I don't have any philosophical or theological problems with it, particularly if I'm planning to eat it, right? And so I'd be interested in going hunting. And I'd be interested in having a conversation about what guns represent and to whom. But I think the dog, or the tail wagging the dog, is the NRA, and the idea that we have that we protected the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, but if you read the early drafts by Madison, he actually his first and second draft, the House passed it, the Senate didn't, and then they revised it in like 1789 or something. The first draft of the Second Amendment included the right for religiously scrupulous people to refuse to bear arms. And he had Pennsylvania and the Quaker mission there firmly in mind. And that got written out. And so when I tell my unit, like, look, I'm happy to serve in the military, I'm just going to do it nonviolently, that failed to compute in part because we wrote out, the Senate failed to pass a protection for religiously scrupulous people, such as myself, to refuse to bear arms. Because they knew there was a lot of Quakers during the Revolutionary War who wouldn't take up arms, but who participated or engaged and supported the war by other means, just not violent means. And so we get kind of pigeonholed into guns and violence and death. And it's like, actually, you can use guns for other things. And there's non-lethal forms of violence and things of that nature. So I think, what you said initially, I think we're losing shades of gray and the blacks and the whites, and the binary thinking is really, finding its way into all kinds of ways of thinking. And it's really quite scary.
It is. It's quite scary, and it's completely counterproductive. And I feel like that we've moved to a place in America where it gets so spacious for people to sit around some sort of a common table and have dialogue. It seems to be evaporating very fast, to where you only want to hang out with your own tribe because they think like you, they don't challenge you, and therefore they won't disagree with you. And I feel like that's a very scary place to find ourselves in,
Yeah.
right now. And
Well,
and
I hope we find ourselves. Sometimes we don't even see it.
Yeah. Oh,
like we don't
you're
even
right.
know that we've like wrapped ourselves in bubble wrap and like, yeah, that's what scares me, is that we'll just never realize how isolated we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then speaking about like isolation, I know you work with veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's many of us, especially a lot of our listeners here, would say that the government really has not had the backs of veterans. I know in many instances, continuing that veterans have been denied like basic rights for their service, and I know that's a whole rabbit trail we could go down, but I want you to speak for like especially faith communities. Like, what have you seen from the church in regards to ministering to soldiers and outreach, etc., like in that vein?
So we might get into self-promotion.
Oh
a little
no,
early,
self-promotion.
The
Go ahead.
well, I think, I don't know, it's depressed. I haven't seen much. Typically, what I see is that it kind of adheres to party lines. So patriotic churches do a really good job of sending people to war, and often bringing them back. Often there is like the veneration piece, and sometimes there's some space for lament in service members in patriotic churches. And then in pacifist churches, I think they've kind of lost track of the line of thinking, I guess. So to use an example, I went to the Mennonite convention, which happens every 2 years, and it's always around July 4th because convention centers are really cheap. And they had me do a panel actually for youth, and I talked about the military and being a soldier and all the complications. And in the span of 12 hours following that, I had 5 young men come up to me. This is Mennonite convention, so these are young Mennonite men in churches, clearly plugged in because they came to some conference. And they said, almost word for word, each of them said, I'm really interested in joining the military. I want to protect the innocent. I want to have, some adventure. But if I do, my community will maybe they won't shun me, but maybe they will. And so what I told them, because again, I'm a practicist, I said, look, be a firefighter. Be all the adventure. Women love it. And you don't have to carry a firearm. But what that disclosed is that the Anabaptist tradition has lost sight of, the journey from point A to point Z, right? And so we know we're pacifists. We've forgotten why, or the why is connected more to a reaction to a conservative statement rather than scriptural or cultural elements that have informed pacifism in the Anabaptist tradition. And so I joke, I studied under Hauerwas after I read a bunch of his material in the military. And I was actually kind of disappointed at Duke because there are a lot of young men and women, mostly men, who would sit in his lectures, and I got the sense like they thought they were pacifist just because they giggled when he would say shit. But if you ask them, like, what does it mean really to be a pacifist? And they didn't have any straight line answer. And I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, so I know a lot of the arguments that get thrown around. But this is a top tier research institution, and we're pushing 250 every single cohort in and out of this seminary. And most of them don't know what the heck they're talking about. All they know is that to be a Christian is to be a pacifist. And that worries me because we put the pacifist cart before the discipleship horse. And so at that same Mennonite conference, I went to a workshop on male spirituality, thinking, I'm going to get my head out of this whole military stuff. I'm going to take a break. And I go to this male spirituality workshop, and we break into groups, and there's like 5 at my table, and every table has a set of like picture cards. And this exercise, this guy that's leading us is doing, okay, there are all these cards, and some of them they're all vocations or jobs. And I want you to sort out which one is the most meaningful or important or whatever. And we open our little deck, and there's however many, and there's like a farmer, there's like a There's one that's like clearly a preacher. There's an artisan or a craftsman or something. And then there's a crusader. And immediately the first card that my table goes for is that crusader. And they push him off to the side. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, well, we know where this one goes. And I thought to myself, and beforehand, I should have said, beforehand, we had to decide what makes a man. And the first one that my group decided on was fights for what is right. And then 10 seconds later, the crusader or the soldier, Christian soldier, whatever, immediately gets shoved off to the side. And if there's one thing that soldiers have been willing to do through time, it's to die or possibly die, risk dying for something they believe in. So there's this cognitive dissonance between, what it means to pursue the good and aspire to the good, and what that might cost, and the like actual reality in which we're embedded, right? And part of that is in the medieval period, like they took monastics, which were isolated and self-sacrificial and aesthetic and all that stuff, and then they combined it with killing, and they said, well, our penance is going off to war, and maybe we'll come back and go to heaven because we killed people. And that really messed up the church's head. And so I'm more concerned that too often either side of the fence is actually responding to reactions instead of like real substance. Yeah. And I don't know. Well, the how I've tried to counter that is to remind churches. And you asked me about ministry and all this stuff. And one thing that I find really important is to share those soldier stories, to get people back into the way of thinking like Christian soldiers are human beings. I want to humanize Christian soldiers, remind people that there's a living story to which their stories are subplots. That story is a story of salvation history. Like we can't write out Joan of Arc. We just can't. Or if we do, then we're just kind of arbitrary and selective, and it's all about me, and I think I know what's best, and Joan of Arc just doesn't cut it. We'll take like Maximilian Tebessa, who refused to be conscripted and was beheaded. But, Joan of Arc, I don't know what to do with, so we'll just push off to the side of the table. We know where that one goes. And so my second book was For God and Country in that order. And I profiled 40 some odd different Christian soldiers that challenged this binary between God and country, between faith and armed service. And that was the whole point, was to like bring attention to this middle ground. And churches using these stories and using the stories of the saints. In fact, I wrote it with the Mennonite Press, and they, for some of the canonized soldiers, I included short prayers, novenas, and they were real sure they did not want those prayers in there. They had me rewrite them to make sure that they were addressed to God rather than the saints, which I'm fine with. But it's kind of this cool little thing. I managed to get this really Catholic practice into a Mennonite Press. But that's been my answer. I haven't found a whole lot, and that's kind of why I do what I do, because someone's got to do it, and we really need to get thinking about this better, because soldiers and veterans are killing themselves, and they're doing so because they're internalizing the crappy stuff we say about military service, or they're internalizing the silence, and we're not doing the work of moral formation and discernment because we don't want to talk about religion and politics. And I think that creates a direct threat to the lives and the human dignity of Christian soldiers. And I think that's a huge problem.
Well, and so speaking kind of on that line, and speaking actually more into the work that you're doing, so I want you to kind of, I don't know, speak about this in a certain twofold way. Like, that what or how, I guess, how should faith communities be different right now? And then kind of in light of that, how do you think they should be? Meaning there's changes that can be made, but then there's this idealized way that I think that you may have an interesting perspective to speak into of how faith communities should look like, especially with how they embrace and interact and minister and nurture to veterans as well too. Because I mean, that's one of those things you'd mentioned earlier. We've kind of been talking around this whole idea of binaries. Is that there are people in our culture that have many different issues that they are dealing with, many different experiences that they've gone through. And to be able to say, oh, we will minister to these people, but these people not so much, which
Yeah.
the church has done that exceedingly well. You can fill in the blank on who those people are over history. But especially from like your heart and from the work that you've done, what is a better way?
So I'm the more we talk about binaries, the more we reinforce them. So I thought at first, like, well, here's what a pacifist church can do, and here's what a patriot church can do, and I hope that I can find a middle ground. And one thing, I have to credit my wife, Laura Isaac. She's a deacon in the United Methodist Church here in North Carolina, and she asked me, when she got this job, she works in Chapel Hill, actually, University UMC. And they were thinking about, like, what should we do for Veterans Day? And she has this resource that she's got this sacred vow with. And so we were brainstorming. She had this idea. So just Veterans Day, for example, churches always think they have to say something, and that's fine. You can say something about it being Martin of Tours' feast day. He was the first soldier saint not martyred for his faith. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But they typically, or Memorial Day is another big one, sometimes July 4th. Usually get churches that will say, would you please stand if you're in the military or if you're a veteran, and everybody stands and you clap. And the problem with that is it assigns positive moral value to military service. And that's only half the equation. There's some things I did that do not deserve applause. And I know that. And when people applaud for it, that's deeply morally confusing. So she and I had this idea, mostly she had this idea of, which is especially pertinent for Memorial Day. But she said, what if you flip the script? What if you said, okay, you start from the outer layer of the onion end. If you don't know anybody in the military, no family members, nobody, you've never had any conversation at any length with someone that you know is in the military, would you please stand up? And you go one onion layer inside. If you have a distant relative or an acquaintance that that you've talked to who's in the military, and that you care somewhat for, but maybe they're not, in your life every day, would you please stand up? And then you bring the onion layer in a little bit further. If you've got someone in your family, who's family or close friends who's in the military, would you please stand up? And then you say, if you're married to someone in the military, if you're a military brat or sibling, and then everybody's standing, and theoretically, the people who are not standing are going to be veterans or service members themselves. And then you could say, now if you're standing up, keep in mind you have a responsibility to care for those people who need to be picked up sometimes, who find it too tiring to stand up, who have stood up for our rights and for our freedoms and our values, who may be conflicted about their military service. It's your job to pick them up when they fall. Now, if you're sitting down, look around you, and these are the people who will support you when you're feeling down. These are the people who have a responsibility to bring you all the way home, not just a couple of days a year, but all the way home into the arms of God and into the arms of their loved ones. You have a responsibility. Now, please sit down, and we'll get on with worship. And I thought that was so powerful. And the pastor at the time decided not to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, no. But I love just the picture that you were painting, and the idea that, and I think this is the thing that we miss, that on a larger scale as humans, that we're all in this together, and especially in faith communities, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And, and I think that is just beautiful symbolism. And then you had to go and break my heart and say the pastor wouldn't do it, which doesn't surprise me at all.
It's happened twice now. I even did it. I pitched the same thing to do it in orientation, because when I started at Duke, I had a really hard time. The counseling representative, you get free counseling as a student. He came and he was explaining doctor-patient confidentiality. He made some joke about, like, you can tell me anything, or you can tell us anything. You can tell us you kicked your dog, you kicked your spouse, you're cheating on your tests. You can even tell us that you've killed someone. And then my entire entering class burst out laughing. And I sat there thinking, like, well, I guess I'm not going to be going to that counseling service.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, it's everywhere. It's not just churches. It's other non or parachurch organizations and communities. And yeah, the tendency is to write people out. Like Joan of Arc doesn't make sense. My buddy, or GI Joe, it just conflicts with my understanding of what the church is, and so I'm just not going to deal with it.
Okay, so as we're starting to kind of get to the end of this conversation here, here's what I want from you. Two things, because especially I do this a lot on the show, but what I do is I want to hear this from your perspective, because I think that you can give me something. So basically, at this moment, screw our listeners. This is just for me. But when we speak about like American Christianity, as we've kind of been dancing around this topic over this past hour, tell me this. So one, what is pissing you off about the state of American Christianity right now? And then two, what is giving you hope?
Well, we don't have to go into detail, but I think I identify more in general with progressive ideals. Here in North Carolina, I got arrested for Moral Mondays a couple of years ago. I really feel strongly about protest and about putting your bodies on the line. But then a Confederate monument came down in my hometown. And this monument was to a composite character, a composite soldier. In fact, the inscription on it was for the boys who wore the gray. And you don't call officers boys. You call certain kinds of people boys. And this monument was the only monument that a certain caste of people had to look toward in terms of recognition for what they or their family had been willing to sacrifice. And I spoke up on social media. I said, and this was following the protests in Charlottesville, where a neo-Nazi killed a young woman, a counter-protester. And it was centered on a statue of Robert E. Lee. And you can trace Robert E. Lee's history. Someone can say, and has, his own ancestors or descendants have said, look, he didn't want any statues of himself. He didn't want to keep the wounds of war open. So we can actually, it's concrete and particular. And so I found out that the statue in Durham wasn't the first that went up outside the courthouse. The first was World War I. 3 years later, the Daughters of the Confederacy put up the statue, and after World War I, where the Great War and the great soldiers had all this recognition, and the soldiers from the war against the North, as they say down here sometimes, they didn't get any recognition. 90,000 Confederate soldiers were conscripted. The penalty was death. And there was a lot of poor white people in the South that got drawn up into this thing, just like I was drawn up into the global war on terror because I needed money for college. And so I advocated for the composite, even modern military, which is largely white, largely male, largely uneducated, undereducated, largely poor, and largely Southern. And a lot of people did not like that. And they insisted that I decenter myself. And that what they didn't understand was that I was actually speaking from a position of marginalization and oppression. And that was my being a veteran. Because we have all these stories that we tell about vets actually pushes my story out of reality. So that we want to believe like Chris Kyle in American Sniper, or we want to believe like, I don't thank you for your service and everybody's broken. And so, and then more recently, actually in the last couple of days, the Moral Monday movement, the repairing the breach or something, they put veterans up on their social media and said, it's veterans like this, like this guy or that gal who are, leading the charge for civil rights and dignity and blah, blah, blah. And I called them out. I said, until veterans have the same equal rights and civil rights that other marginalized populations do, that's not the vision that Martin had. And so many people don't even know that veterans are a protected population, federally protected population. But the laws that they have are limited and really poorly enforced. And this is deeply ironic because it was largely black veterans coming home from World War II Medgar Evers. The names are escaping me, but like they saw their service and their equality with other white soldiers, and the military was integrated in 1948, and it was that deep disconnect between I just fought for our freedoms and I don't have freedom. That was the spark that led to the civil rights movement. The earliest disability protections were for vets. And now there is no protection for vets unless they're disabled under ADA. And so I brought this to a number of people's attention, and that's further pissed off people in the progressive movement. And so I think what pisses me off now is the same sense of tribalism that I experienced when I was getting out of the military, where it's either or. I proposed that progressive groups simply add veteran civil rights to their list of priorities, because we do not have civil rights, not against hate crimes, not for fair housing, not for access to education. We have some employment protections, but they're very, very limited. And all of a sudden it became like, well, how are they more disenfranchised, or like, doesn't this take away from this and that and the other thing? And I thought, like, we've kind of got our minds made up, like, and what's deeply disappointing to me is that military service is about subordinating your needs for the needs of the whole. I was consciously taught to ignore physical pain and spiritual pain. My back went out when I was 30, and I didn't even think to go to the emergency room until Laura, who's now my wife, told me, hey, you can't walk. Maybe we should go in. So we're really good at putting others before ourselves. But when we do that, when we continue to, as a society, as a civilian society, when we ask them to fight and fight and fight, and they don't have any support structures, formal support structures, I think that's exploitative. I think that's directly causing harm to people who are already, kind of have a little bit of a Messiah complex. I'll gladly climb up on that cross and totally ignore the fact that it's already occupied. And that's a problem. Like I have to remind myself to do self-care. And in terms of advocacy and social justice, to ask people to keep breaking themselves, to keep spending their time and energy, emotional and spiritual energy, when they don't have any kind of safety net as veterans. I think that's a big problem. It pisses me off. In terms of hope, I'll try and make it quick. I think, I think it's relatively straightforward. So because of all the civil rights stuff, like I know kind of how you get laws passed. I don't want to say, because I guess like you kind of have to be secretive about it. But it's relatively easy. You just have to kind of put in the work and be really strategic, and then it's kind of a catch-all, or it can be. And so I was deeply cynical about politics and about voting. And I remember this back and forth about whether or not Christians can vote back in like 2008 and 2012. But I don't know. I think there's hope in the political process. There's hope in community organizing. There's hope in building coalitions. And so I see some of these solutions, and I think that gives me hope that like there is actually light in the end of the tunnel, and it's not inconceivable that this could happen, that we get civil rights, that we talk about Christian soldiers differently. I think it really could happen in our lifetime, where we kind of take stock of our own heritage and start to, not backpedal, but kind of like catch up to our own kind of rhetoric and start unspinning some of these things that we've gotten spun up.
Well, Logan, if people are, this is, again, I'll kind of ask you a loaded two-part question here. So I guess the first part is kind of what is on the horizon for you? What's coming up next? What are you excited about in the work that you're doing? And then secondly, how do people find you? If people are interested in knowing more or reading more, how do they stalk you? How do they track you down? How do they find you?
Well, I'm on most social media, and I got a website, iamloganmi.com, and my handle is iamloganmi, I-A-M, Logan, M as in Mike, I as in India. And the thing I'm really excited about now is standing up a social enterprise that will help humanize soldiers and pick people up out of spiritual and material poverty through education, advocacy, and the arts. The first project I've got that'll be dropping this spring is a book, bike, and conversation peddler I call Spoken Polite Company. You can find out more at spokenpolite.com. And it's exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to sell used books and coffee from a book bike and inspire conversation in people, to get them talking about Christian soldiers, about politics, and then hopefully possibly stand that up to a brick and mortar coffee and bookshop in the future. But at least for right now, in the spring, I really want to kind of, once the weather hits and people are coming out to farmers markets, I want to kind of hit them with things that'll piss them off and get them talking, and see if I can, learn what buttons I can push. But that's the most immediate thing on the horizon. I'm also doing a lot of things around pilgrimages and iconography and writing, but it's all kind of all over the place. The one thing I'm really excited about is definitely Spoken Polite Company.
Well, Logan, I just first of all, I just want to thank you so much for being on the show. I just want to thank you for just being so open and sharing your story. And
it's my pleasure.
I appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's vital. And I think that it is a great thing that you were setting forth to do. And so I don't know, I wish you the best, and I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Great. Yeah. I've had a great time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Logan.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Aqueduct Conference Centre was established in 1978 as a peaceful destination for small group meetings, special events, conferences, retreats, and weddings. For more information, go to www.aqueductcc.com. We are also sponsored by Lumen. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be better than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.